So, the bullies that worm their way inside your head. So, trigger warning, do not compare. Do not compare with Emma Watson. So I read this week that she was age 30 and she was okay about being single. And she described herself as being self-partnered, which, no cigarette at the back please, that does not mean self-pleasuring. So it's the point being is, I guess, that I think the BDD is all about your relationship with yourself. And here is somebody who is has a lot of compassion and respect for herself. She has a healthy relationship with herself. And the problem, of course, being in BDD is that there's a very unhealthy relationship with yourself. You would not probably want to marry and partner yourself, or you would be in a very abusive relationship. And so I think that the problem is in BDD your relationship with yourself, a lot of bullying and shaming of yourself. What I wanted to consider today is, how did you perhaps end up in this position with these gremlins in your head making your life a misery? So first of all, to state the obvious, pigs do not get BDD. We have to put, first of all, I think, an evolutionary context, that it's tricky, it's very difficult being a human being. And you didn't ask to be born human. You know, life would be a lot easier if you were, in this case, a pig. And, you know, the problem is in our brain. We have an old brain, which we share with reptiles and mammals, which is designed very much to keep us safe. And it's responsible for all that fight and flight reactions to keep us safe. But human beings, of course, have got a new brain. And that's what makes us human in terms of being able to communicate and be creative and go to the moon and all sorts of other fantastic things. But equally, it has that Achilles heel. It's also got that ability to worry, to shame ourselves, and to really activate our old brain. So we've got these tricky loops going on between our new brain and our old brain. And that's probably one of the key components in biological terms as to why we have this bully in our minds. And of course, you know, we need to accept that probably about, like most emotional disorders and many physical disorders, there's about a 40% heritability in terms of our DNA, that we don't fully understand yet, obviously, how the DNA influences the development of a particular emotional disorder, but we need to acknowledge that fact, I think. And it may be influencing certain temperaments, that those individuals perhaps with BDD tend to perhaps probably be either shy as a child, or have perfectionist traits, or be very anxious as a child. And all these things are going to make you more vulnerable to developing BDD. And something I don't fully understand yet is that people with BDD, compared to other emotional disorders, seem to more likely to have an occupation, higher educational training in art and design. And that's why we often see at these conferences, I think, many very creative aspects to BDD. And so there's what we think is that increased aesthetic sensitivity. What we don't really know is whether it's just an association or some sort of causal factor in the development of BDD. And how does that relate to the bully? Is it the bully that gives that creative urge as such? We don't really fully understand that yet. And we also need to acknowledge, I think, there are many influences in the development of BDD, but it's probably not different from other emotional disorders in terms of emotional abuse, like humiliation; physical abuse, being regularly beaten; physical neglect, like not being given enough food; or the more greater likelihood of lots and lots of different types of abuse and neglect in early childhood, of course, is going to be stacking up, not just for emotional problems, but also actually physical health problems, whether it's coronary heart disease and hypertension and so on. It's just one part of the jigsaw that I think we need to understand. And the crucial thing for me often is the feeling of being different. And there are all sorts of things that may make a young person different or feel different. It could be something that's less valued in appearance, like the fact that you may be wearing glasses. It could be that you're a smaller height or have got a smaller breast size, something like that. Or it could be a condition that's since been surgically corrected, like having bat ears. Or it could be a variation of normal appearance, like having red hair. Or it could be a condition that's improved since adolescence, like acne. But being different generally, it could just be being homosexual, from a different race or culture, or having a specific learning disability. There are all sorts of things that individuals who with BDD may often feel that they were different as an adolescent. And that's when often other adolescents may start to pick on those particular differences. And the problem with adolescents is that they hunt in packs, and they pick on, the weakest link, or the thing that does make you different. This is the key issue is often being shamed, humiliated, having contempt by others. And of course, there's lots of other new ways of doing this online and other subtle ways. And one of the key understandings, certainly in development in childhood, is that problems often are either internalizing or externalizing. So BDD is very much in the internalizing way of coping with distress, where people become more withdrawn and ruminate more, and so on, and have anxious. So it's all characterized often by this shame, where you end up adopting a very submissive role. You have to then monitor what it is that you are ashamed about and try to please others. On the other half, of course, is having an externalizing type of problem, probably more often in boys, but manifested more by physical aggression, disobeying rules, cheating, stealing, destroying property. But they may end up, of course, being the very bullies for the children who internalize their problems. And we need to understand that those who externalize their problems are just as insecure, but they try to create a sense of security and control by bullying or overpowering others. And that, of course, is important to understand when it comes to understanding your own bully, when it comes into your head. And these are, of course, not conscious chosen strategies, but they develop in the context of genes and environment and all the other things that we've just been discussing. And of course, not everybody with BDD is bullied or teased, but they grow up still feeling different and then start to want to go to try and understand what is different about themselves. And so they then start to look for flaws or reasons that make them different, and are then spending time comparing and ranking their features against others, and start to develop that internal shame. And as I've always recommend to our trainees, is to spend at least an hour in front of the mirror this evening with a little bit of Wagner or something in the background to make them really depressed, and to really focus on those parts of themselves that they don't like, and to then start to ruminate and compare and rank themselves. And we can almost guarantee to induce that BDD very quickly, so that it's quite easy to do if you just spend that time in front of the mirror and using selfies and really focusing in on those bits that you don't like. So whether you've been bullied by others or just constantly comparing your feature, trying to understand what it is that's defective and flawed, the next step is really clever, because the bullies then worm their way inside your head. You take on their voice, their criticism, and all the emotional memories of them. And that internal bully can be verbal comments, or it can be a dialogue, or a felt sense like the anger and the contempt and disappointment. And it can either focus on your parts of your body or just yourself in general. And as time goes by, the project is complete, because the person with BDD has now developed that sense of self as what we call an aesthetic object. Something to be stared at with excessive self-focused attention, where the features really define the self or the identity of the individual. And of course, all the evaluations of being ugly and all the shame of the self. And you can see the feeling of spotlight on the individual. So what the problem is that the bully activates that internal threat system. And the key words are always things like better safe than sorry. And our threat system in the old brain is very much designed to keep us safe. We are not designed to be happy. And what's often, I think, really important is trying to understand what's the motivation of that internal bully and shamer. So there are some key questions to ask yourself, or in therapy, in chair techniques, or trying to really understand your bully. You know, what's the greatest fear if you gave up your internal bully? Or what's the motivation of the internal bully? And more often than not, it's sometimes about self-improvement. More often it's about keeping you safe, keeping you warned of the dangers, or when it gets very severe, the idea that somehow you deserve it. But these are the common motivations of the bully. And the key thing is perhaps to understand how bullies often develop from past memories. You can stand back and see through them, hopefully, and make those emotional links. Not always, but it's a common narrative. But the most important thing is to recognize that they do not act in your best interests. They're driven by a desire to keep you safe, but they're actually mistaken in what it is they're doing. And perhaps you need to have a lot of courage to stand up to them. Often perhaps try and make that bully into a cartoon character, as you have seen there, like the Trump figure. It's almost like a buffoon type character in your bully. But you do need that courage, therefore, to meet what was, remember, the Wizard of Oz, to be able to stand up to the Wizard of Oz and actually check out that actually it's just an old man behind the curtain who is making you try to feel scared. And recognizing that the bully is not acting in your best interests. What can you do? You try to develop a different relationship with your bully. It's almost like thanking it for trying to keep them safe, but no thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. And encouraging and soothing that scared part of you, because it's the bully who's also very insecure and very frightened, and it's just externalizing its way of coping. And so this is where we talk about cognitive behavior therapy, which might focus on some of those old aversive memories and using things like compassionate mind to try and help encourage you to stand up to these bullies and to be able to use a soothing rhythm breathings and soothing safeness in order to tolerate some of those feelings. I'm going to finish now, I think, and I think we've got plenty of time to ask a few questions. I've stunned you all. I see we've got a few minutes. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating to hear and very, very thought-provoking. I wanted to ask a little bit about the sort of more global dimensions of this disorder and ask particularly, for example, I know my daughter who suffers with this kind of body image thing buys an awful lot of products from South Korea and Korea, and the whole notion that cosmetic surgery and skincare and everything is not seen as an exceptionally disadvantaging thing in some aspects of the parts of the world, or perhaps some future visions of the world, but something which is essential in a very competitive world. And I wondered if the research shows very different patterns in different societies, or whether we're all following, everybody's following, this condition is following some kind of global trends, or whether it's very particularly rooted in particular societies.
Well, we don't have enough research, but certainly in some cultures there seems to be a lot more emphasis on the importance of appearance. I've travelled in the Philippines and Brazil sometimes, and there seems to be a lot more shall we say, identification with the importance of appearance in yourself. And as you say, there seems to be a lot more perhaps cosmetic surgery and other beauty-enhancing products in those particular cultures, which is out of all proportion to their GDP and so on. So I'm sure there is a cultural influence in the same way there may be more, some families put a lot more emphasis on the importance of appearance.
Sorry, just to answer her question, I know in Korea, every family, everybody has to have a cosmetic procedure. And unfortunately, I've been in the industry for 28 years in cosmetic surgery type of lasers. And for the last 3 years, we have an influx of Korean companies coming and marketing their products, especially the PDO threads for lift. And it's quite worrying that we have allowed them to come in, not as a company, but general idea that it is spreading from Korea to the UK, and I'm really shocked and surprised that companies are here, and they are #1 marketing people in this country now for cosmetic procedures, and it's very sad.
Because the notion is it's normal.
They have to have it. Like I always tell my patients, if you're from South America, don't get me wrong, you must have a cut and stitch. The same philosophy in America. It was not that popular in the UK, but recently, in the last 4 or 5 years, it's gone out of control. And it's shifting more towards the youngsters, 21, 22, rather than late 40s.
Thank you. The compassion approach, is that a part of the NHS guidance? Is it available on the NHS? Is it something you'd advocate?
It's not generally available on the NHS. There's still trying to build more of an evidence base for it. I think the evidence is much more about the processes involved, and it hasn't yet really, it has translated a bit in certain types of personality difficulties and depression, but it's still limited. It's not yet widely available. But I think some of the principles can be incorporated into a lot of the standard sort of psychological approaches. But certainly my experience is actually even with the most severe people with BDD, it's very difficult to start to try and apply these principles. It always depends, I think, partly upon how flexible you are in your thinking. Yeah? And the more rigid your thinking, the more difficult it is to apply.
Hello. This side. Other side.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Got you.
What are the common practices or traits that you see in people who have kind of got a healthy, sustained recovery? Like, what are the things that people seem to have work for them long term?
I think it's much the same as any other disorder where you're starting to connect with others, you're starting to develop healthy relationships, you are doing things which are important in your life, and you're not avoiding, and you're not living in your head, you're not ruminating, you're not constantly comparing. Yeah?
Thank you.
Hello. Do you think there's a danger that we are sleepwalking into BDD-type tendencies under the guise of health and well-being? I've worked in the fitness industry for 20 years, and I see a huge surge in tracking fitness communities under the guise of community, but actually are we just encouraging obsessive behaviour on an acceptable daily level in terms of... even things like pitting skinny against strong now, are we just ultimately saying you're still not quite enough as you are? And that as a society we could be sleepwalking into something that's just too extreme for individuals.
So we need to do what? How are we going to change society? I'm not very
Sorry,
good.
I didn't realise that was a question back. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, but so the implications are what? How are we going to change society?
Do we, as individuals, or if we're in a relevant profession, have a duty to flag this up and say, is something, I don't really want to name names, is a really prominent, popular running app actually as shiny and giving and positive as it makes out it is?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you saw this morning a really excellent talk on digital detoxing, and I think there was a lot of guides there about, in terms of what might be helpful and not helpful. So, yeah, I do agree with you.
Thanks.
Is there any information about recovery being more common in female patients than male patients?
Sorry, so going to be recovery
more common in female patients than male patients?
I don't think so. I mean, you tend to get just as many men and women recovering.
Thank you.
Any more thoughts about bullies inside your head? It's just accept that, well, that's just the way it is.
Just a question about the bullies.
Yes.
There was in one of the support groups, one of the ladies mentioned about, and it's something I remember finding particularly difficult, is separating yourself from the BDD. It took me years to do that. And one of the things that helped me was I had something called ego state therapy and the compassion-focused therapy. And it was the ego state therapy that made me clock that the BDD voice was actually separate to me and not part of me.
And what did you find helpful to be able to separate that in terms of externalizing?
Yeah, well, she did
distancing.
This work on looking at what was behind the BDD. So, and she said my particular problem, and obviously different for everybody, is that I'd almost like, when I'd had trauma, I'd shut down that part of myself, and I almost had like split selves. And we actually held meetings between the parts of myself, which for me that worked, and I could hear the BDD as a separate voice. It was when it sort of actually became a separate entity. Yeah. And then I started to be able to talk back to it and stand up to it and use the strong parts of myself to kind of counter it. And with the compassion, we did the compassion focus. I found that very helpful to actually talk to myself in a compassionate way, which I realised I'd never been doing. I'd been listening to this bully going, oh my God, the bully's right, oh my God, it's because it's true. Because it is like a bully, it knows where your weaknesses are and it hits you on anything. The truth's irrelevant, it's just we'll find, that's why my BDD obviously can move around. What are your tips for people on how to identify as a bully and not themselves? That's a bit of a huge question, but
I do think it is important. I think you had a more complex type of problem with the trauma, and as you say, there may be different identities within you that you were trying to hold, and having that, trying to integrate those different identities is obviously the goal in any such therapy. But I think if you can start to label it and start to recognize it's not acting in your best interests, you can understand it and empathize it in terms of what its motivation is, but it's just misdirected. It's not helpful.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for that. This is just a thinking aloud thing, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts might be on it. So when you're talking about the bully in your head, I've done training with the National Centre for Eating Disorders on anorexia and bulimia, and one of the things they talk about with anorexics is often they have this voice, the anorexic voice, which sounds quite similar to the bully. And I'm just thinking about what you were saying about, before you said about fight and flight, and I'm just wondering whether things like anorexia, OCD, BDD, whether there's something about it being a freeze response. And I just, because they thought, that idea of keeping them in a loop of paralysis, really.
Sure. So freeze response is often occurring when the anxiety is overwhelming, and you end up in a freeze response. But there are other often problems in eating disorders. It's often more about control, and some types of OCD and BDD is often about control as well, trying to control your emotions and your sense of thoughts and feelings and so on, so that's often kicks in, and it functions, of course, as a way of avoiding and not experiencing.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering if there's a connection, because obviously freeze is the unconscious thing, whereas the like what you're saying around the control, it's almost like a step reaction. So you have freeze, which could link to control, which could link to these different symptoms, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
the freeze, as you say, it's very automatic and involuntary. And so the first step is always trying to be aware of what you're doing and trying to stand back and observe what's happening, so that you can choose more to try to do something differently and to ground yourself in that situation. It's difficult. I mean, there's no easy answers for some of these things. It must be time to move on, isn't it? I didn't think I had this long, actually.
Do we have time for one more over here?
I'm always fearful of actually having too much information.
Thanks, Prof, for the lovely talk. Just wanted to find out, did you find any ethnical variations in the ethnic population about more in certain group, BDD?
No, we don't have enough information on that.
No.
So it's back to the question, I think, about culture, isn't it? Whether perhaps certain cultures may have more or less of appearance concerns.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Great.
Sorry.